When professional turns personal without crossing a line. The rarest kind of connection. There are connections that announce themselves loudly. And then there are the ones that never ask to be noticed. They don't arrive with drama. They don't demand attention. They don't blur lines or create confusion. They simply exist, quietly, steadily, built on something far stronger than impulse. This is a story about that kind of connection. The kind that grows not because rules are broken but because they are respected. The kind that becomes meaningful precisely because no line is crossed. Why most connections fail in professional spaces. Professional environments are not designed for emotional depth. They prioritize efficiency, performance, control. Most people learn early to protect themselves by staying distant. Others mistake familiarity for permission and cross lines too quickly. Both paths lead to problems. Distance prevents trust. Overstepping destroys it. So when two people manage to stay close without crossing boundaries, it feels unusual, almost unnatural. But that rarity is what makes it powerful. The importance of clear roles. At the beginning, everything is clear. Roles are defined. Expectations are set. Responsibilities are understood. And clarity creates safety. They knew where they stood. They knew what was expected. They knew what was not allowed. There was no ambiguity. And because there was no ambiguity, trust could grow without fear. Respect as the first bridge. Before warmth there was respect. They respected each other's time, each other's limits, each other's effort. They didn't interrupt. They didn't dominate conversations. They didn't dismiss opinions. Respect showed itself in listening, in acknowledgement, in consistency. And respect is the most underrated form of intimacy. Because when someone respects you, they see you clearly, without trying to take anything from you. The subtle shift from awareness to attunement. At some point, awareness turned into attunement. They began to notice changes. A shorter response. Quieter mood. A hesitation that hadn't been there before. They didn't ask intrusive questions. They didn't demand explanations. They adjusted instead. They slowed down. They softened their tone. They gave space when space was needed. That adjustment was never announced. But it was felt. Care that never asked for credit. Care appeared in the smallest ways. A reminder given gently. Pause allowed without explanation. A moment of understanding without commentary. There were no grand gestures. No emotional displays. No visible claims. Care existed without needing recognition. And that kind of care is rare, because it's not performative. Why restraint made it stronger? They could have done more. They could have said more. They could have leaned further in. But they didn't. And restraint made the connection stronger, not weaker. Because restraint communicates respect. Because restraint signals awareness. Because restraint protects what matters. They understood something many people don't. Not every feeling needs expression to be real. Reliability as emotional security. Reliability came next. They showed up when expected. They followed through. They didn't disappear under pressure. There was no unpredictability. No emotional whiplash. No inconsistency. Reliability creates safety. Safety creates calm. Calm allows closeness to grow without anxiety. When conversations grew deeper, not personal, their conversations evolved, but carefully. They didn't overshare. They didn't cross into personal territory. Instead, they shared understanding, perspective, insight. They spoke about work, yes, but also about values, about how they approached challenges, about what mattered to them professionally. That kind of exchange builds intimacy without exposure. The difference between being close and being invasive. They were close, but not invasive. They didn't ask questions that weren't theirs to ask. They didn't assume access they hadn't been given. They didn't take advantage of comfort. They understood that closeness is not about proximity. It's about permission. And permission was never taken. It was respected. How boundaries created freedom. Because boundaries were clear, they felt free. Free to be quiet. free to be tired, free to be human. Nothing was misinterpreted. Nothing was exaggerated. Nothing was weaponized. Boundaries didn't restrict the connection. They protected it. When being seen stopped feeling dangerous, there came a point where being seen felt safe. They could show uncertainty. They could show vulnerability without exposing private lives. There was no judgment, no gossip, no pressure to explain, just understanding. That safety is the foundation of every lasting bond. How care strengthened the work itself. Interestingly, the work improved. Communication became smoother. Collaboration became easier. Trust became automatic. Care didn't distract from professionalism. It enhanced it. They worked better because they understood each other better. When distance was still honored. Even as closeness grew, distance remained. They didn't blur personal time. They didn't intrude on private spaces. They didn't demand access. Connection existed where it belonged, and nowhere else. That discipline is what kept it clean. The quiet observation of others. Others noticed something. Not behavior. Not gestures. Energy. Alignment. Nothing dramatic. Nothing obvious. Just two people who worked together unusually well, and treated each other unusually gently. Why it never turned into confusion. There was no confusion because there was no mixed intention. Care wasn't a strategy. Closeness wasn't manipulation. Respect wasn't conditional. Everything was honest. Even in its restraint. When personal didn't mean possessive. Personal never became possessive. There was no jealousy. No control. No entitlement. Connection didn't mean ownership. It meant consideration. And that distinction kept everything balanced. The strength of unclaimed connection. They didn't label it. They didn't define it. They didn't claim it. And because it wasn't claimed, it stayed pure. Some connections don't need names. They need care. Why most people don't experience this? Most people rush. Most people confuse access with intimacy. Most people cross lines before trust is built. This kind of bond requires patience, self-awareness, emotional discipline. That's why it's rare. The quiet depth that lasts. Because it was built slowly, it lasted. Because it was respectful, it endured. Because it was intentional, it didn't collapse. Nothing dramatic happened. Nothing explosive occurred. And that's why it stayed meaningful. When professionalism became the foundation, professionalism wasn't a wall. It was the ground everything stood on. Gave structure. Provided clarity. It ensured safety. Within that structure, something real grew. Epilogue. The connection that never needed explanation. Some connections don't need defending. They don't need explaining. They don't need proving. They exist quietly. They function cleanly. They endure naturally. When professional turns personal without crossing a line, what remains is something rare. A bond built on respect, sustained by care, protected by intention. And those are the connections that last the longest.